The pawn is the weakest piece in chess and is the basic unit of comparing the relative value of the pieces, just like you use carbon 12 to find the relative atomic mass. Anyway, it is also the most abundantly found, with each player having 8 of them in the starting position. Philidor once famously stated, "Pawns are the soul of chess." So in today's video, we will be looking at the advantages and the disadvantages of the pawn, followed by the ideal conditions for it, and then we shall conclude 5 important principles to help you use the pawn like a mighty soldier. Let's dive right in. Firstly, we shall look at the advantages and the disadvantages of the pawn as a piece. In the advantages, we have it is of less value, like a pawn is a pawn, so it's very good for both attack and defense. Well, since anything defended by a pawn can only be attacked by a pawn, this makes it a great defender, especially of central pawns. So as you can see here, the d5 pawn is attacked several times, but it has only one defender, which is e6. But since the defender on e6 is a pawn, white should not dare to take the d5 pawn. The same applies for attack. I mean, if you attack any minor piece or major piece for that matter with a pawn, they have to move or capture the pawn. They have to take action. They can't just ignore the threat. For example, if you attack a bishop with a queen and the bishop is already defended, then the bishop doesn't have to do anything, right? But no matter how much defended the bishop is, if you attack it with a pawn, it will have to do something, right? Or it can get captured. So this makes it a good attacker and a defender because it's of low value. A pawn is a pawn. It also controls both colors, unlike the bishop. No offense. But when it moves, it captures diagonally. So with every step it takes, it alternates the color that it starts to control. So a pawn on a dark square controls the dark squares diagonally adjacent to it, and so on. This advantage is probably the most evident, and it is that the pawn can promote into another piece. So imagine like you have 8 pawns and all 8 of them promote into something. Your arsenal will definitely be upgraded, right? Although this doesn't happen usually, the very idea that the pawn can promote into something makes it quite a dangerous threat. Since, as we will see later, a passed pawn can be quite the headache for your opponent. And finally, it can control more effectively than other pieces. So if you want to control the center, control it with pawns because you cannot argue against their control. If a knight is controlling one square, then the opponent knight can come and fight back for that square. But if a pawn is controlling a certain square, then only an enemy pawn can fight to gain control of that square. Let's move to the disadvantages. It cannot move backward, so every pawn move creates some weakness, whether relevant or irrelevant. So for example, let's take the starting position. When I play e4, then the squares f4 and d4 get a little bit weaker, as the e4 pawn can never move back to e3 to defend those squares. However, this weakness doesn't really matter, as I can always play g3 to defend the f4 square, and then I can play c3 to defend the d4 square. But playing these moves would further weaken squares around them. So you see, every pawn move is a complicated trade-off. You are controlling new squares but giving up control of some previous squares. So this is why you should carefully evaluate any pawn move before playing it, as maybe the weakness may be more important than the squares you're controlling. The second disadvantage is that it is quite immobile and could take many moves to reach its destination. The pawn covers very less distance at a time, so it takes quite long to reach somewhere. It's quite a slow piece in general. And the final disadvantage is that it is vulnerable to getting weakened and targeted. So you see, a pawn, if it's separated from its brothers, then it can become a point of target for the opponent. This is why we will see in the coming principles that you should keep your pawns together. Now let's look at the conditions which favor the pawn. They are better when together. Unity is strength. So what this basically means is that it's good to have as few pawn islands as possible. Now what is a pawn island? As you can see in this position, the 4 queenside pawns are on adjacent files, so they can support each other in the near future. This is called as one pawn island, and the kingside pawns are separate from them. They can support each other but cannot support the queenside pawns unless there is a capture which brings them closer to the queenside pawns. So this is why you should try to keep as few pawn islands as possible. If you see in the starting position, all the pawns are on adjacent files, so it is one big happy pawn family. But as the game progresses and things happen, they might get separated. So in general, it's good to keep as many of them as close together as possible in order to avoid any one of them getting targeted. Pawns are also good for defensive purposes. As we had already seen, a pawn is basically the lowest unit of comparison, so it cannot really be captured if it's defended by a pawn. I'm not saying you should always defend with pawns, but defending with pawns is a great idea, as they are the lowest unit in chess and therefore cannot really be captured. They are better in chains where friendly pawns support each other. So if you don't know what a pawn chain is, take a look at this position from the French defense. The long pawn chain that black has going all the way from f7 to c4 is called a pawn chain. And now it's evident why this is such a good formation, because the f7 pawn supports the e6 pawn, the e6 pawn supports the d5 pawn, and so on. And this is why this makes them a very robust and very, you can say, hard to attack fortress of pawns. You should try to keep pawns in chains if possible, as that way they support each other. But there is one drawback of doing this, which is that the pawn at the back of the pawn chain is always vulnerable, as you can't move the g7 pawn to g8 and defend the f7 pawn like that, right? So you have to consider these things in mind, but usually it's good to keep pawns in pawn chains. A passed pawn is quite dangerous, so it can become a great asset to have. For example, in this position, the pawn is passed, which means that it has no neighboring pawns which can compete for squares in its path to promotion. This also means that the pawn will be a threat for the opponent, as every time I push the pawn, I get one step closer to promoting it into another piece, hopefully the queen. It is good for controlling important parts of the board like the center, as we had already realized. Controlling the center with pawns is a much more effective strategy than with minor pieces. We will also see an example of this, so just keep patience. Now, based on our newfound knowledge, we can now condense these facts into 5 simple, practical and positional principles, followed by some instructive examples. The first principle: think twice or even thrice before a pawn move, as they cannot move backward. So in this position, it might be tempting for black to kick the centralized knight on d4 with e5, but after knight e2, the knight has evaded the threat, and look what remains. The bishop on g7 stares at its own pawns, so even if it goes to f8, it would still be staring at d6, so its scope is completely shut off, while the knight on e2 now has a clear path to the outpost on d5. In case you don't know what an outpost is, it is a square which is protected by a friendly pawn but cannot be attacked by an enemy pawn. And it's clear why, right? Because moving the pawn to e5 has not given the black to move it to e6, from where it could actually control d5. But now, since the pawn is on e5, the d5 square is weak, and not only that, now the d6 square is left behind and it is vulnerable to attack. So white can potentially play knight c3, knight d5 and build up pressure on the d6 pawn, which is quite a good prospect for him. The second principle is that you should try to control the center with pawns to the extent possible. So let's look at an example where white is trying to control the center with pawns while black is trying to do so with his knights. E4, knight f6, e5, knight d5, the Alekhine opening, d4, and now here the standard theory is d6. So even the theoreticians agree that at some point black will have to fight back in the center with his pawns. But let's see an example where black only uses his minor pieces. So he tries knight c6, but after c4 the knight is forced to move, and now after knight f3 we are threatening to play d5, c5, completely dislodge the knight, send them to hell, and basically they don't have a bright future. While our central control is extremely dominant, and I don't think white can lose this game. As you can see, pawns are excellent at restricting enemy pieces, especially the knights, which just happens to be our third principle. Since pawn capture diagonally, they are amazing at restricting the knights, as can be seen. So just to sum it up, the third principle is use your pawns to restrict the enemy pieces, especially the knight. Moving on to the fourth principle, try to create a far advanced passed pawn, even if you have to sacrifice a bit. So this basically brings us to the quality versus quantity comparison. As you can see here, white plays b6. So in this position, ideally white would be losing as black king is closer to his pawns, and if white does nothing, the black king will reach the white pawns, capture them and promote one of his own pawns. But white plays b6 with the idea of capturing either c7 or a7 and potentially queening the pawn. But black, being smart, takes back with cb6. But now, should white capture back or should he play something else? The correct move here is a6, because now after b takes a6, c6, the pawn on c6 is unstoppable. And as is clearly visible, white's single advanced outside passer outperforms 3, yes that's right, outperforms 3 of black passed pawns, simply because they aren't as advanced as the white pawn on c6. And in fact, white will queen in 2 moves and black can resign. Now if you're asking what happens after a b6, the same thing applies in a mirror image. c6, b takes c6 and a6, and here the a pawn queens. Moving on to the last principle, blockade the enemy passed pawn or pawn weakness. Don't allow them to advance and trade for your friendly pawn. In this position, black has successfully managed to block the weakness on d4, which could have potentially advanced and traded itself with the e6 pawn, thereby eradicating the weakness. But black doesn't allow this, and now he can simply play e5 and white loses the pawn due to the pin. If you want more information on such positions, which are known as isolated pawns, do check out my video here. And now you can see the pawn is pinned to the rook on d1, and there are too many attackers on this pawn. So yes, that's gonna be it for white. Well, that's it for today friends. Please make sure to like and subscribe so I can keep making content like this. Until then, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.